The phone screen flickered to life on the polished wood table. I love you. Drowning in work. I owe you a massive date night, okay? The world didn't just slow down. It ground to a complete, excruciating halt. 3 tables over. Back turned. It was my husband. His hand, the hand that touched my face this morning, was slowly, intimately tracing the wrist of a woman wearing a striking red coat. She threw her head back, laughing a little too loud, her eyes bright with the smug triumph of a woman who had just won. Around us, the other patrons continued their conversations, oblivious to the murder of my marriage happening in plain sight. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A single tear didn't even risk falling. I just bit down hard on my lower lip, assuming a terrifying absolute calm. But as my muscles coiled as I prepared to launch myself across that floor, a hand velvet-gloved, elegant yet brutally cold, pressed firmly onto my shoulder, anchoring me to my chair. "Don't do it," a low voice said. "Walk out there now, and you step directly into the trap he's been meticulously building for you." I turned to look at this stranger, a woman easily in her 60s, and a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a moment of pain. It was the first structural crack. "I'm Emily Hale. I'm 39, senior copywriter. I used to be the woman with the perfect 10-year marriage and a career I had fed with my own blood sweat and brilliant, exhaustingly hard intellect. Before I show you how I tore my life back from a traitor, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where in the comments you're listening from." In that first second, I thought I was in a fugue state. Glasses clinked around me. His signature scent, cedarwood and rain, still lingered faintly in the air. But the man who had held me through my darkest nights, he was dead. Right there. In his place stood a monster of pure, devastating calculation, spinning a plot to strip me of everything I held dear. I fixated on the watch on his wrist. It was the gift I'd bought him with my very first big paycheck. I watched the seconds tick by, counting down to the moment I would unleash my silence upon him. Not long ago, I was the queen of his world, but lately the narrative had changed. He kept calling me unstable, urging me to skim and sign authorization forms for our assets, for my company. My mother's words from my wedding day echoed in the chamber of my mind. "Emily, never give a man the power to define who you are. Because if you do, they will rewrite your entire history." I used to think she was cynical, a bitter woman. Turns out it wasn't cynicism. It was an autopsy report for the murder of my innocence. The velvet-gloved hand didn't shove me. It anchored me to the chair with deliberate, terrifying gravity. I turned. The woman sitting beside me was in her early 60s, her silver hair swept into a flawless chignon. She smelled of aged sandalwood and cold, hard experience. Her eyes held absolutely no pity. Pity is a currency reserved for the broken, and she flatly refused to look at me that way. "What exactly is your plan?" she whispered. Her voice was as flat and still as a frozen lake, yet every syllable carried weight. "Storm over there. Throw your martini in her face and scream at your husband in the middle of a crowded lounge. Don't do it. Walk out there right now, and you step directly into the trap he's been meticulously building for you." I froze. The bloodless knuckles of my hands digging into the marble edge of the table slowly began to uncurl. The stranger's words hit the boiling chaos of my brain like a bucket of ice water. In the absolute peak of betrayal, blind rage is always the easiest, most primitive reflex. But a good liar always factors in your madness. If I exploded in that moment, I would instantly mold myself into the exact caricature he needed, the hysterical, unstable wife, providing him with a room full of credible witnesses. But if I stayed silent, if I just sat here and watched, I ceased to be the passive victim. I became the lead investigator of my own life. Pressing my spine flush against the cold leather of the booth, I took a slow, agonizing breath, forcing the frantic hammering in my chest to steady its rhythm. I started doing the one thing I was ruthlessly good at: analyzing behavior and dissecting subtext. I stopped looking at the two people 3 tables away through the bleeding lens of a cheated wife and started watching them with the clinical scrutiny of a senior copywriter. Under that analytical gaze, the grotesque illusion of their romance immediately splintered. Ethan wasn't relaxed. The way he leaned toward the woman in red looked intimate to a casual observer, but if you knew him, you saw the rigid tension in his shoulders. That wasn't the body language of a man drowning in the intoxication of a new affair. That was the coiled posture of a predator, closing a high-stakes corporate deal. He reached for the leather briefcase resting on the empty chair, the custom briefcase I had commissioned for him in Florence for our 5th anniversary, and extracted a slim manila envelope. He slid it smoothly across the marble tabletop. The woman, Vanessa, didn't receive it with the bashful, fluttering gaze of a lover. She took it with the pragmatic half-smirk of a partner who had just negotiated a highly lucrative split. She pulled a stack of documents from the envelope, her eyes darting over the dense print with practiced speed. Then, with an air of absolute ruthless professionalism, she retrieved a fountain pen from her purse and slashed a sharp signature across the final page. It didn't end there. The second the ink dried, a third man materialized from the shadows of the bar. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, he carried the distinct predatory aura of a corporate lawyer or a cutthroat financial broker. He gave Ethan a curt nod, extended a hand for a firm, definitive handshake, the kind that seals a binding contract before carefully tucking Vanessa's signed documents into his own briefcase. The entire exchange took less than a minute. Seamless, not a single wasted motion. They meshed together like the gears of a flawless machine. My heart, which only moments ago had been twisting in the agonizing grip of jealousy, suddenly froze solid, replaced by a profound, hollow disgust. When you force yourself to strip away the blinding veil of emotional trauma, the cold, mechanical gears of deception are laid bare. The most devastating betrayal isn't the discovery of another woman in your husband's life. It is the horrifying realization that the entire shared reality you built together has been quietly dismantled, restructured, and liquidated while you were entirely unaware. This wasn't a stolen afternoon rendezvous. This was a transaction, a corporate merger. And I, the lawful wife currently drafting copy to build our family's future, was the asset being liquidated. Good, the older woman beside me murmured, as if she could physically read the grim epiphany locking into place behind my eyes. She stood up slowly, smoothing the crease of her wool coat. She placed a minimalist foil-stamped business card on the table. It bore only a name, Lydia Mercer, and a phone number. "When you are ready to stop playing the grieving wife and start taking back what belongs to you, call me," she said, her tone light as air but heavy as iron. "Because what he is trying to take from you is much more than just your marriage, Emily." With that, Lydia turned on her heel, slipping gracefully into the quiet stream of patrons exiting the lounge into the evening dusk. Left entirely alone, I sat motionless for exactly 10 more minutes. I drank the rest of my water, the ice fully melted, feeling the freezing liquid slide down into my empty stomach, extinguishing the last pathetic embers of my naivety. I packed my laptop, shoved my strategy notebook deep into my leather tote, and walked straight out through the revolving glass doors. The evening wind rolling off Lake Michigan slapped my face. It was brain-numbing cold, but it rendered my mind sharper and more brilliantly clear than it had been in years. I started the engine for the drive home. In the tight, silent confines of the car cabin, Ethan's text, "I love you," was still glowing radiantly on my phone screen. Only this time, as I stared at it, a cold, unfamiliar smile crept up the corners of my mouth. I finally understood. The cheap little affair playing out in the lounge back there wasn't his crime at all. It was just a perfectly constructed smokescreen hiding a heist that was infinitely more ruthless. The car crunched along the gravel driveway, pulling into the garage of the $2 million suburban home we had built together. Through the lens of the car window, my home appeared aching in its perfection. Warm yellow light, spilling from the living room, a manicured lawn, the silhouette of the ideal husband smiling behind the solid oak door. But as I crossed the threshold, the beat of the truth began to hammer a sickening rhythm in my chest. The air thick with the scent of garlic butter and searing steak, a feast prepared and waiting. Ethan stepped forward, his smile calibrated to the millimeter. He reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear, then placed a soft, practiced kiss on my forehead. "You're late. You look pale. Emily." His voice was low, soothing the timbre of a devoted protector. He wrapped an arm around my waist, letting out a small, curated sigh. "I told you that agency is draining you. You've been so forgetful lately, so irritable. You're pushing yourself to the brink. Just let go. Let me handle everything." I stood frozen in his embrace, allowing the familiar scent of cedarwood and rain to invade my senses. Only yesterday, I would have buried my head in his chest and let the tears flow in gratitude. Tonight my skin crawled. No confusion, no avoidance. The man who had signed away assets with his mistress in that lounge hours ago was now slipping seamlessly into the role of the husband, heartbroken over his wife's mental state. He wasn't hiding the lie. He was browning it in the rich butter of concern. Internal monologue. 5-0. The most ruthless men do not abruptly pack a suitcase and leave. They choose a more elegant savagery, slowly, patiently convincing the world, and sometimes you, that you are falling apart. They transform you into an unstable patient, so they can step tall as the self-sacrificing caretaker. Never, not for a single agonizing second, let another human being hold the pen that writes the history of your own mind. 2:30 a.m. The house was submerged in a heavy, suffocating silence. Ethan's steady, even breathing drifted from the other side of the king-size bed, rhythmic and disgustingly innocent. I slipped carefully from the silk sheets, my bare feet touching the cold hardwood, drifting down the hallway like a ghost toward our shared office. The blue light from the laptop screen cast a harsh pallor on my face, like an overhead light in a surgical theater. I am a senior copywriter. I live by dissecting language structure, finding logical fallacies in contracts, reading the invisible intent beneath the superficial text. When I cracked his encrypted personal folder, I didn't find cheap text messages or illicit photos. I found something far more lethal. I found the legal drafts for a new LLC. I found a chain of emails with financial advisors with the glaring subject line, "Strategy for Asset Protection," during wife's emotional instability. But the deepest knife twist was the attachment. He had attached my medical records from 2 years ago, the darkest months of my life, following the loss of my pregnancy. The sleeplessness, the anxiety, the brief hiatus from my career. Ethan was the only witness to those nights when I collapsed on the bathroom floor. The only person I trusted with that absolute vulnerability. And now he had meticulously extracted every agonizing sob, packaged them into clinical data points, and curated them as medical proof to justify full financial control, arguing that I was legally incapacitated due to psychological trauma. Internal monologue. 5-0. They will take your deepest vulnerabilities, the pains you exposed in absolute trust, and forge them into chains to fasten around your neck. A woman's true strength isn't in hiding her wounds, it's in daring to look at that bleeding past and ruthlessly refusing to let anyone use it as evidence against her sanity. The next morning, while the gray fog of dawn still clung to the city's skyscrapers, I pushed open the door of a desolate cafe. Lydia Mercer was already there in a quiet corner, an untouched black espresso centered perfectly on the rough wooden table. She didn't waste a moment on the currency of pity. Through the faint plume of steam from her cup, Lydia calmly unfurled the bloodied blueprints of the past. Her presence in that lounge yesterday was not a coincidence. "Ethan has a formula, Emily," Lydia said, her voice steely and cold. Years ago, a widow in her 50s, wealthy, isolated, crossed his path. He stripped her of everything, not with a gun or a violent crime, but by systematically branding her hysterical, paranoid, and oversensitive. He eroded her credibility until no one believed a single word she said. That was my sister. Lydia had stood in the shadows for all those years, quietly tracking his moves, waiting for the devastating moment he grew arrogant enough to repeat the deadly loop with a new target. This time, she chose to step into the light, not just for revenge for the dead, but to stop me from becoming the next hollowed-out version of myself. Internal monologue 5-0. There is a profound, steely sisterhood among women who have survived systematic manipulation. We do not save each other with screaming or tearful hugs. We save each other by coldly spreading out the blueprints of the exact traps we once fell into. I clenched my fingers around my warm cup, feeling a steady, almost cruel resolve beginning to form in my chest. The legal drafts in Ethan's computer and the blood-stained history of Lydia's sister had snapped together, forming a complete picture sharp and lethal as a razor blade. Those hidden documents proved one horrifying truth. Ethan was not planning a messy divorce or an expensive breakup. He was meticulously directing a complete erasure, psychological and financial, orchestrated to bury me alive while I was still breathing. 3 in the morning. The home office was so suffocatingly quiet, I could hear the blood pulsing against my temples, a slow, aching rhythm. The 27-inch iMac cast a cold, blue-gray pallor across my face, illuminating a reality so brutal it stripped the air from my lungs. If the manipulated medical records from the previous night were a knife to the ear, forcing me to listen to Ethan's treachery, what lay before me now was a direct surgical incision into my soul. 2 windows were open side by side on the glowing screen. On the left was my private _drafts folder. Inside lay the entire strategic architecture, the taglines and dozens of pages of consumer psychology for a brand positioning campaign I had named Natural Resilience. It wasn't just a corporate project. It was the absolute distillation of my intellect over 2 grueling years, written during the sleepless, teeth-gritting nights as I navigated the grief of my lost pregnancy. I had drained the deepest, most private wounds of my womanhood to craft a message meant to reach the bottom of millions of other women's hearts. On the right was a PDF I had just extracted from Ethan's hidden email server. The title, Seed Funding Pitch Deck, Founder and Chief Strategy Officer, Ethan Hale. I scrolled. Every sentence structure, every carefully weighted word, every razor-sharp insight about beauty born from the fracture. He had copied it wholesale. He hadn't altered a single comma. He had simply coldly erased my name, pasted his own over it, and packaged his wife's bleeding trauma into a lucrative startup pitch to hawk to investors. Internal monologue 5. Oh, society programs us to weep in devastation when we lose a husband's heart. But when you discover the man you share a bed with has plundered your intellect, it strikes a completely different nerve. The heart can heal, but the mind is a woman's solitary, sacred sanctuary. When a partner tramples through that sanctuary for profit, he crosses a savage line that no love on earth has the right or the authority to excuse. I closed my eyes, forcing the freezing ambient air deep into my lungs. My mind began linking the data points with the cold velocity of an analytics engine. If Ethan was using my strategy to launch an LLC, who was he planning to sell it to? My fingers flew across the keyboard. Corporate registries, LinkedIn, internal portfolios. I typed the name I had glimpsed on the edge of that document in the lounge, Vanessa Cole. It took exactly 30 seconds for the final velvet curtain to drop. The face of the woman in the red coat stared back at me from the leadership page of a premier natural cosmetics conglomerate. Her title, Director of National Partnerships. Her conglomerate was the exact whale Ethan was desperately trying to swallow. A dry metallic click echoed in my brain as the gears locked perfectly into place. That afternoon in the lounge was never a romantic rendezvous. It was insider trading, dressed up in the cheap lingerie of an affair. Ethan didn't use my brilliant strategy to woo a naive little mistress. He used it to manipulate a powerful executive, making Vanessa worship him as a visionary. And the document she signed that day, it wasn't a blank check or a love letter. Bathed in sweet promises of building an empire together, he had set Vanessa up to become the legal co-signer of his shell company. Internal monologue 5. Oh. It is so easy for a scorned wife to hurl curses at the other woman. But sometimes she is just the next prey burrowing deep into the insulting illusion that she was chosen. Ethan wasn't getting down on one knee to hand Vanessa a romantic empire or a throne. He was coldly handing her a civil death sentence, turning her into a human meat shield to bear the full legal liability when his intellectual property theft was exposed. Outside the window, the sky began to bleed into a pale, bruised dawn. From down the hall, I heard the rustle of sheets as Ethan shifted in his sleep. 15 steps. That was all it would take to walk into that bedroom, throw this stack of papers in his face, and watch that smug counterfeit mask shatter instantly. I could call Vanessa right now and tear apart the illusion of the flawless entrepreneur she was currently worshipping. The thirst for immediate revenge rose like bile thick and choking in my throat. But my fingers retreated from the keyboard. I locked the screen. If I exposed him now, safely behind four walls, he would have the oxygen to squirm. He would use his silver tongue to gaslight me, claiming it was shared marital property. He would call Vanessa to shred the documents. A cornered rat in the dark can still bite and escape. I didn't want a messy domestic dispute. I wanted an execution for his reputation. Internal monologue, Vive O. Timing is the razor-thin line between a miserable tragedy and a magnificent triumph. When you hold absolute nuclear truth in your hands, you are never allowed to scream it into the void. A seasoned copywriter always knows exactly when to deliver the million-dollar punchline. You must step back into the shadows and wait until the stage is fully set, the spotlights are blinding, and the entire audience is holding their breath. I pushed the laptop shut. The metal snapped together with a sharp, decisive crack. He thought he had found the perfect business partner and a lucrative mistress, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just hand-delivered me the exact lethal weapon I needed to crush them both. Noah Bennett's law office sat on the 42nd floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that looked down over the gray concrete arteries of Chicago. There were no soft boxes of tissues here, no sympathetic nods you'd find in a marriage counselor's suite. Here, across the cold expanse of his walnut desk, there was only the law, assets, and survival. I slid the manila folder across the wood. Noah, a seasoned apex predator in family law, initially leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed his face, braced for the tearful monologue of a scorned wife crying over a younger mistress. But as his eyes scanned the diverted cash flows, the drafted LLC filings, and specifically the comma-for-comma cross-reference between my original strategy notebook and Ethan's startup pitch deck, his entire posture shifted. He leaned forward, his spine suddenly rigid. "He isn't just cheating on you," Noah said, his tone carrying the clinical precision of a scalpel. "He is committing marital fraud and intellectual property theft. Can you prove the timeline on these original drafts?" "Every single draft has an encrypted timestamp on my agency's internal server dating back 2 years." I replied, my voice a flat, waveless line. Noah nodded, a rare glint of professional respect flashing in his eyes. He gave me one solitary rule, my line between life and death. I had to continue playing the faltering, compliant wife. I could not let Ethan smell even a shift in the wind, not while we were quietly hammering every single nail into his legal coffin. Internal monologue 5. Oh, justice is never found in tearful confessions or heart-shattering screaming confrontations. Justice lies dormant in paper trails, electronic timestamps, and cold, unfeeling data. If you want to defeat a master manipulator, you must stop speaking their high-risk language of emotion and start speaking the ruthless language of undeniable facts. That night, returning to our silent suburban home, I turned my office into a war room. Under the amber glow of my desk lamp, I systematically downloaded my original files, cross-referencing them against Vanessa's corporate emails and the business registries Ethan had covertly filed. I saved every credit card receipt he had disguised under the banner of client entertainment. Every click of Save As echoed like a dry gunshot in the dead of night. As I watched the green download bars creep toward 100%, I realized I wasn't just archiving data. I was saving my own life. Internal monologue 5. Oh. There is a quiet, profound, and immensely proud power in transforming your absolute grief into a series of administrative tasks. Every encrypted file, every carefully archived screenshot was another stitch I was using to sew my shredded dignity back together. I realized with a clarity so sharp it brought tears to my eyes that my worth and my survival had never and would never depend on the cheap fidelity of a man. 2 days later, Ethan came home earlier than usual. He undid his top button, poured a glass of red wine, and stepped up behind me at the kitchen island, wrapping his arms around my waist. His hold tightened gently, his breath smelling of mint and Pinot Noir brushed against the nape of my neck. "This weekend is our anniversary," he murmured, his voice hitting that perfect resonant timbre of a protector. "I don't want to do anything too loud, just an elegant dinner here at the house. I've invited my mother, the Davises, and a few close friends. I want everyone to see that our family is still standing strong." He took a slow sip of wine, then dropped his voice, feeding me a line laced with a counterfeit sorrow that made my skin crawl. "And Emily, that night in front of everyone, I want you to sign over power of attorney for some of our assets and the family trust to me, just to take the burden off your shoulders. With our family there as witnesses, you'll feel secure knowing I'm always here to carry the weight for you." My heartbeat froze. My chest tightened, not out of pain, but absolute revulsion. This was his endgame. A flawless psychological ambush wrapped in the velvet illusion of family. Internal monologue. 5. Oh, abusers and manipulators endlessly crave an audience. They know exactly how to weaponize your basic decency, turning your politeness into a pair of handcuffs. He calculated that sitting in front of my mother-in-law and our oldest friends, the desire of a well-bred woman to maintain social grace would force me to grit my teeth, smile, and obediently sign my own death warrant. He planned to use my own elegance to choke me. I turned around slowly, burying the razor-sharp glare beneath my lowered lashes. I looked up at him, offering a fragile, perfectly calibrated smile. "Okay, whatever you think is best." Ethan turned and walked toward the living room, pulling out his phone to confirm the catering order for the most expensive dishes. Through his reflection in the large bay window, I could see the supreme arrogant smile of a man who believed he had just successfully called checkmate. He smiled with total satisfaction as he finalized the menu for our elegant anniversary dinner, blissfully drowning in his own ignorance, completely unaware that I had already written the closing scene of his carefully curated life. The dining room that night was suffocating heavy with the scent of half-melted beeswax centerpieces and the distinct cloying stench of hypocrisy. Seated at the head of the table, Ethan looked like the cover model for a Man of the Year issue. Under the glow of the crystal chandelier, 10 invited guests, including his own mother, our trusted family attorney, and longtime business partners, sat in rapt silence, listening to his tear-soaked anniversary speech. 10 years. Ethan murmured, his pitch catching with absolute flawless emotion, his sorrowful eyes locked onto mine. 10 years to truly understand the crushing weight of the vow, for better or for worse. Everyone at this table knows the brutal psychological shadows my Emily has had to battle since our loss. She is exhausted. And as her husband, I refuse to selfishly stand by and watch her grind herself into dust for another second. He gave a subtle nod. From the shadows, the caterer stepped forward, placing a silver tray on the marble table. It didn't hold an anniversary gift. It held an elegant leather-bound legal folio. Ethan slid it gently toward me, placing a Mont Blanc fountain pen beside it. "Emily, these are the documents to establish a comprehensive family trust. Please, darling, sign them. Let go of the crushing burden of our assets and your career. Let me be your shield against the rest of the world." A few of the female guests dabbed the corners of their eyes with linen napkins. His mother looked at me, nodding in gentle encouragement. Internal monologue. 5. Oh. When an abuser constructs an iron cage in the middle of a crowded room, painting it the brilliant gold of protection, you must not flinch. Sit perfectly still and surrender the stage, allowing him to perform his masterpiece to the very end. Because the higher the moral pedestal his narcissistic ego builds, the more bone-shattering and spectacular his inevitable fall will be. I looked at the silent pen on the table. There was no violent sweeping of glasses, no hysterical sobbing from a betrayed wife. With the serene composure of a senior copywriter preparing to strike through a logically flawed draft, I smiled. "A magnificent speech, Ethan," I said, my voice crystal clear, as flat and smooth as a frozen lake, instantly severing the room's weeping tension. "But as someone who works with words for a living, I have to correct your terminology." I casually opened my handbag and withdrew a red-bordered manila folder. I dropped it dead center onto Ethan's leather-bound folio. It landed with a dry, heavy thud, the definitive strike of a judge's gavel. "First, the law doesn't call this protection," I said, my hands moving with practiced fluidity as I pulled out copies of the documents, sliding them precisely in front of every guest at the table. "The law calls it financial abuse. You are all holding the incorporation filings for a shell LLC that my husband covertly established last week, funded by directly siphoning our joint marital savings." The benevolent smile on Ethan's face flash froze. A vein at his temple began to throb frantically. "Second," I continued, tossing his seed funding pitch deck onto the table, right next to my original strategy notebook, with the encrypted timestamps circled in bleeding red ink. "You don't want me to let go of the burden of my career. You want to strip me of the intellectual property for the Natural Resilience Campaign, a project I wrote in my own blood and tears, erase my name, and sell it to a rival conglomerate. Emily, you're insane." Ethan shot up from his chair, slamming his palms on the table, his calm mask completely ripped away. "These are paranoid delusions. You're having an episode, give me that garbage. Internal monologue fee. Oh, you never need to raise your voice when the ironclad evidence is already screaming on your behalf. Crossing your legs, taking a slow sip of wine, and watching a master manipulator desperately backpedal, choking on his own irrefutable data. That is the most elegant, ruthless closure a woman could ever ask for." Right as Ethan lunged across the table to snatch the dossiers, the heavy oak dining room doors burst open. The sharp, rhythmic click-clack of stilettos echoed against the hardwood floor. Lydia Mercer walked in, radiating the cold, imperious aura of a vengeful goddess, and stepping in right behind her was Vanessa. The woman who had worn that proud red coat in the lounge was now dressed in a sharp corporate suit, but her face was the ashen gray of a corpse. The dining room went dead silent. The air caught in Ethan's throat. Guests sat with their mouths agape, too stunned to breathe. Vanessa didn't even glance at me. Her eyes locked like daggers onto the IP theft evidence scattered across the feast. As a senior executive, she didn't need anyone to connect the dots to see the blood-soaked legal trap she had just walked into. "You told me this was a startup project you had nurtured for years," Vanessa hissed through her teeth, her voice trembling not from a broken heart, but from the radioactive fury of a woman who realizes she's a sacrificial lamb. "You fed me sweet lines to get my signature as your co-founder, Ethan. You never wanted to build a future with me. You conned me into signing on as your legal meat shield, the designated fall guy, when your federal intellectual property theft blew up in your face." "Vanessa, listen to me. It's a misunderstanding," Ethan stammered, reaching a pathetic hand out into the empty air. But Vanessa recoiled, throwing her hand up to block him as if his proximity was toxic. At the far end of the table, his own mother covered her mouth, tears of absolute paralyzing humiliation spilling over her cheeks. One by one, our oldest friends stood up, dropped their linen napkins onto their chairs, and walked out of the room without a single word of goodbye. Internal monologue. Vive O. The ultimate defeat for a narcissist is not the loss of a compliant wife or a naive mistress. It is the exact moment he is entirely stripped of his control over the stage. When the women he planned to manipulate, gaslight, and pit against each other for his own profit, decide instead to stand shoulder to shoulder in the blinding light of the truth, his entire empire of lies simply evaporates into nothing. Ethan stood paralyzed amidst a ruined feast of cold, extravagant food. His manic eyes darted around the suffocatingly silent room, desperately searching for a single sympathetic gaze, a single ear willing to believe his crumbling excuses. But there was no one. He looked at me, and in that protracted second, I knew he realized the most bitter truth of all. The phantom of the hysterical, unstable wife that he had so meticulously invented had just executed him with terrifying, flawless sanity. 9 months after that suffocating life-or-death night in the dining room, spring washed over Chicago, bringing with it a light that was brilliant, sharp, and absolutely clear. I sat in the sun-drenched office of Noah Bennett on the 42nd floor, calmly picking up my fountain pen to sign the final page of the divorce decree. The scratch of the nib against the heavy paper sounded impossibly light. Ethan wasn't there. He no longer had the standing, and practically speaking, no longer had the funds to hire an attorney qualified to even step foot in this building, let alone sit across the negotiating table from Noah. Ethan's collapse played out with the precise, inescapable logic of a mathematical equation. The moment our evidence for corporate fraud and intellectual property theft hit the federal docket, his counterfeit alliances instantly disintegrated. Vanessa, operating on the cold-blooded survival instinct of a senior executive, immediately unleashed her cosmetics conglomerate's massive legal team to save her own seat. She severed all contact, handing over every email, text, and transaction history to the court to frame herself as the duped victim. She threw Ethan under the bus without a microscopic fraction of hesitation. Stripped of his polished entrepreneurial facade, denied the family trust he had planned to bleed dry, and blacklisted by the entire corporate sector for his ethical rot, Ethan lost everything. He walked away from our marriage with empty hands, a shattered reputation, and a mountain of legal debt hanging like a guillotine over his head. Internal monologue. 5-0. We often fold our hands and pray for karma to strike down the people who shatter our lives, but karma is rarely a mysterious spiritual force or a miracle falling from the sky. Usually, it is simply the logical, inescapable, and irreversible consequence of their own arrogant miscalculations finally catching up to them. I walked out of that steel and glass skyscraper and hailed a cab back to the agency. I didn't return to the office as a broken 39-year-old divorcee dragging a hollowed-out soul. I walked through the main lobby as the new creative director. The Natural Resilience campaign finally launched to the public, not under the banner of a cheap shell company erected by a fraud, but under my own name. Using the bleeding experiences I had personally healed, I molded a resounding media campaign that celebrated authenticity, self-respect, and the unbreakable internal power of women. That campaign swept the 3 biggest awards in the advertising industry that year. And the best part? The campaign's imagery, anchored by powerful copy, written by my own hand, blanketed massive LED screens and highway billboards along Chicago's busiest arteries. No matter what miserable corner of the city Ethan was currently crawling into to restart his life every single day. He walked outside. He was forced to look up and witness my brilliance. Internal monologue. 5-0. The most exquisite and flawless revenge is never dragging the person who hurt you down into the mud so you can both scream and get dirty. The ultimate revenge is picking up the exact rubble they so callously left behind, building a magnificent masterpiece with your own bare hands, and relishing the fact that they are forced to stand far away helplessly, watching you reign inside it. On a Friday afternoon, I sat in the corner of a quiet little cafe overlooking Lake Michigan. The spring breeze caught a few strands of my hair, carrying the scent of fresh water and absolute freedom. Sitting across from me was Lydia Mercer. She took a sip of her Earl Grey tea, a warm smile touching the corners of her mouth. Her face no longer held the tense, cold defensive armor it had worn that first afternoon we met in the lounge. Her sister, somewhere up in heaven, could finally close her eyes and smile. We didn't mention Ethan's name. We didn't even bother wondering how Vanessa was struggling to cling to her corporate seat. Those people had been permanently canceled from the broadcast of my life. I gently stirred the foam in my cappuccino, feeling an absolute profound peace filling every cell in my body. There was no bitterness, no lingering hatred. There was only a sacred respect and a fierce protective love for my own mind, my intellect, and my endurance. Internal monologue. 5. Oh, healing does not require you to develop amnesia and forget the betrayal. Healing is simply stripping that betrayal of all its power, refusing to let it cast a shadow over your future for one more second. I lost a terrible husband, but in exchange I gained an impenetrable trust in my own intuition. And that is a trade I would willingly make 1,000 times over. The night Ethan texted that hollow, "I love you," he thought he was tightening his grip on my submission. But in reality, he was handing me the pen to write the most magnificent chapter of a new life, completely free and fiercely proud. Looking back at the wreckage of those 10 years, I realized the greatest lesson wasn't learning how to unmask a traitor, but learning how to fiercely protect the core of who we are. As women, we are so often conditioned to compromise, to swallow our pride, just to keep the peace in our homes. But sometimes, that very surrender becomes the fertile soil where manipulation takes root. If I can leave you with one piece of advice, it is this: guard the independence of your own mind, and never hand anyone the pen to write the value of your dignity or your happiness. If you ever find yourself standing in the freezing shadow of deception, do not panic and do not let them see you bleed. Find your absolute stillness, weigh the truth with a cold rationality, and only step into the light when you hold the undeniable control of your own life firmly in your hands. I truly want to know where you stand on this journey. If you had been sitting in my chair at that suffocating dining table watching the trap close around you, would you have held your absolute silence, or would you have played the hand differently? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below so we can navigate this together. If you found a piece of your own strength in my story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your presence here gives me the profound drive to keep sharing these quiet victories of healing self-respect and the unbreakable, unyielding power of women who refuse to be erased.